Good day. In this video, I'm going to talk about whether it's a good idea to repeat yourself in job interviews. And I'm not referring to a scenario where your interviewer does not understand you and asks you to say that again, but rather repeating yourself as a approach to bias the interviewers towards you and get a favorable recommendation, right? And I believe this makes sense primarily in two scenarios. The first scenario would be that every candidate has one or two or three great stories that they really want to communicate during the job interviews, because that's how you sell yourself best. That's what you feel. This is what you feel is the highlight in your career. So then, of course, the more you use your highlights and your strengths, the more likely you are to bias your interviewers as well, right? So it is a good idea to repeat your best stories on the condition that you still make sense. In other words, you don't use the same story twice in the same interview, right? So you could use a story that's your best story in a screening round and then during the final interview rounds, or you could use the same great story with two different interviewers. And if you're worried that you may come across as too pushy, you're only pushing this one and you might lack sufficient experience in the field, you might also employ some techniques here, such as blurring the situation. So first you would say, hey, this happened 3 years ago in company X while I was doing this, and the second time you would reference the story, you wouldn't reference it by name. Okay, so it would sound slightly different. Or another approach that many candidates employ would be to zoom in and zoom out of that highlight in your career and present it slightly differently, right? But it would be the same story that you would repeat in a bid to sell yourself as the better candidate, right? Because the definition of behavioral interview is that they screen on your past experiences as a predictor of success in your future role. Whereas if your past experiences are your best stories, you can understand how her chances to do well is here, right? So the risks here are, quite clear. Repeating the same story in the same interview, you will be perceived as someone lacking sufficient experience, right? And if you overuse, 3 times your story throughout your job interviews, you might still come across as lacking experience or trying to bias interviews, right? The second scenario I'd like to talk about here, where it would still make sense to repeat yourself in a job interview, and I'm primarily referring to senior roles here, would be to intentionally communicate, some key takeaways twice, even in the same answer. Okay, for example, what's your proudest achievement, right? As an interview, what's your best story you prepare for the interview, right? And you could start with something online. Well, the achievement that I'm most proud of is that I delivered the project in half the timeline and I saved the business 5 million. Let me explain. And then you would go with your, star answer at the end, and therefore you say those 5 million. The point in this, to over communicate those highlights, will eventually sell yourself as more memorable, as a high performer, even if they already knew you already saved that 5 million because you said it in the beginning of the answer. But repeating the same highlight will eventually bias interviewers towards you, and this is a communication technique, to bias interviewers towards you. And of course, you should use it. You should know what you're doing with these things if you employ this approach. But if you'll research a little bit, there are these techniques in communication that repeating the same highlights will make you more memorable and will picture you as the better candidate, right? So long story short, you should seriously consider repeating yourself in job interviews, especially for senior roles, and on the condition that you make sense. Okay, so I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.